Good morning and welcome to NycosRPG. We are talking about words today. And we talk about words all the time. We use words all the time. But today in particular, we're going to be looking at the mystery behind role-playing games and tabletop games in particular, because the use of particular terms over time have become problematic for most people. I'm Jonathan Albin, a game master with more than 50 years behind the screen, and I am here to talk about the things that will help your game sessions be extremely wonderful. And the reality of communicating about such subjects leads me to be a bit tongue tied, I think, more because I don't know how to talk to you. And my target audience, of course, are game masters and storytellers. But to a larger extent, today's show in particular is talking to those people who have not ever played a role playing game. And I do have a great interest in expanding that number. That's why I developed the Nycos RPG system, is literally to be the fastest way to get into role play. So we're going to get into all of that, and we're going to go over the terms and descriptions of role-playing games, so that if you are not interested in role-playing games, feel free to see this video here, because this will talk about how role-playing games are useful and why you would want to do so. But more importantly, we're going to be talking in particular today about the specialized language, I guess you would use the term jargon, that role-play gamers and tabletop gamers utilize when conversing about these topics, which will give you a way to work through perhaps the videos that you might have seen about the subject before that seemed like a whole different world. So let's get started, shall we? We're going to be working today in several different categories, and in beginnings here we're going to be talking about the general terms that you need to know in order to play a role-playing game. And right off the very bat, the very first thing we're going to talk about are players and characters and dungeon masters. And I know they're game masters. And the general term of player means any individual who takes on a specified role in a story for the purpose of making decisions, advancing both the story and the character's development. Generally, an invested individual who adds personality and identity to the character and uses the character or as an avatar for interaction with the story, the environment, and other participants during the session towards the collective achievement of group goals and objectives. Specifically, it's a term for the participants in a game. If you are at a role-playing game session and are not participating in the story, then you are not technically a player in the game, even though you are a participant in the game experience. The character is the specified individual or avatar that the person is going to take on. It is generally utilizing a block of statistics, usually on a character sheet, that provide a system-specific description of what that individual is for the basis of tracking its advancement during the game. Generally, a term for the in-game persona that the player takes on. Specifically, characters are the collection of those personalities that represent the players in the game environment. So if you are playing chess, the characters in a chessboard in a chess game would be pawn, rook, bishop, knight, king, and queen. But this is, of course, sort of ludicrous in terms of conversations. You wouldn't talk of the character of the king. Instead, you would merely talk about the way in which that character interacts with the world, and there isn't such for chess. So the game master is the storyteller, the person who is presenting the information. Generally, there is a bit of work in the pre-game phase, wherein the game master will have developed the scene, the non-player personas that the characters might interact with, and the like. in certain cases, a game master can circumvent that or shortcut that by actually utilizing product provided by games manufacturers that have the specific genre, the storytelling, the setting, and everything already established for them. So they simply are the conduit by which the players gain that information in interspersed periodical interaction. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the actual play of the game. But this differentiation between the game master and the players is a pretty solid line, and that is that generally speaking, a game master doesn't include a persona, an individual persona that he plays with the group. Instead, he's going to be doing almost an adversarial role of determining what the players interact with and what the setting variables are, and by nature, therefore, has to be sort of judge and jury, an executioner, so to speak, of activities in the game that are beyond the ken or understanding of the rest of the players. This concept, therefore, sets up the game master as a default or de facto authority on the game. And in most game sessions and most game systems, there is an overarching rule zero. In other words, a pre-game assumption that the players in the game will usually adhere to, which is that the game master is the final say. He gets to have the last word, so to speak, on any given scene or issue in the game. And this has to do with the establishment of an actual personality to the environment. In other words, the story has to be represented by someone, and therefore the game master takes on that role, which means that he gets to say, yes, this happened, or no, this did not happen, as the case may be, when push comes to shove, when you get to that final, somebody has to make a decision or else we can't continue. The game master is the one who is assigned that role. Certain new games systems, although they're calling themselves the old game systems, are set up with a different variance, and that is that the collective has to unanimously agree on an outcome from a conflict instead of having the game master be the adjudicator. And there are some that can play under that mechanism. Generally, that's not the case because there's going to be internal stressors that form when the story and the players reach this position of being at odds, and decisions can be made outside of the hands of the storyteller. But I'm not going to deal with the politics of that. It's just that the game master generally is the person who has that authority. The players then simply moderate. They go through their actions and their decisions, and then wait for the game master to make final decisions about things. It sounds way more complex than mechanically it really is, because generally speaking, we are collectively playing the game, and that the story, the very development of which is put in the hands of the game master, makes sense for them to be the final arbiters. The next word we want to talk about is the session. And a session is generally a blocked out period of time, sometimes known to be in advance, and sometimes can become a marathon. And by that I mean a session can be anywhere from, if you're dedicated to the process, 30 minutes to an hour, all the way up to a 24-hour period where you play nonstop. And the concept of what the session is generally defined before you sit down, although I have been drawn into situations where I'm running the game for upwards of 7 to 12 to 24 hours in a single setting. And usually you're pretty burned out, pardon me, when you have run that extremely long session. But the idea is that that's the coherent time that you spend specifically in the roles as players and as the director of the story in the case. Finally, we've got a couple of terms that are changing. They're adapting as time goes by because they're being perceived differently than when I originally wrote this outline. But this is the concept of in-game versus out-of-game. when games first were developed, it was simply when you were in session as your character, you would make decisions and make call actions as your persona, and therefore you were almost always, quote, in the in-game phase of the game, and there was very little time to discuss things were out that were from beyond the game because there was so much data that had to go back and forth between the storyteller and the players. And the idea here of the in-game versus out-of-game mechanic really has to do with whether a statement made in-game is part of the story or whether what was said was really meant to be beyond the boundaries of the setting and the scene, and therefore it would be out of game. This term over time has been modified a lot, and so we're going to be talking about a third term in a minute. We got one more to go, but we'll come back to that. So next is the concept of min-max. You may still hear it from time to time, but most often that term has now been replaced by a more palatable term, I suppose, to those who do it, and that is optimization. In our world, we have gotten to the point where we sometimes accept mistakes in a system because the system isn't running efficiently or it takes a few extra steps for something to process. And so when that happens, when we talk about improving the system, we talk about operations, and we want to optimize the operations. We want to make it more efficient, make it what we want it to be more than it has been. And in previous iterations or in previous portions of life, the idea of optimization really didn't come into it because we instead just lived through the experience and related the experience in our own personal vernacular so that the players around us understood what was going on. But the term min-maxing in those days was considered to be a player or even a game master wanting to hedge the die rolls so that there was a increased chance of success or a better chance of succeeding at the particular activity that's being optimized, so to speak. And the challenge with optimization is that often it requires a thought process that is outside of the parameters of the environment that a person would be in. For example, we in modern times know about firearms. So if you are playing in a fantasy setting where no firearms exist, the awareness that there are such will lend itself to a player who is attempting to min-max by having that persona try to find a way to create such an item in the inside of the system to optimize his outcome. In other words, if you develop a firearm in a world that has none, then it's like the man with one eye in a blind world. You are going to be king. You're going to be the basis from which the whole world is measured. And so therefore the idea of a min-max would be someone who's found a workaround within the system that provides some unique advantage that may not have been considered by the storyteller or other players at the table, and therefore adjusts or revises the world overall on that basis. And so today's world, we instead look at that as we see it all the time in our work environment. Our computer has to update periodically because there's new information and new, for example, bad actors who are trying to modify access to information, and therefore we have to update our security codes. We have to update our mechanisms in order to continue forward, and that is, in essence, optimization. And so this concept of what was an absolute negative in the term min-max, that's determining the minimum and maximum and adjusting the game flow to give you the advantage. Switching that over to a more palatable optimization fundamentally gave people the permission to not only think in terms of how to make it better, but also fomented the very idea that they were supposed to. And this leads us to our final term, and that is the concept of metagame. Now, earlier we talked about sessions having a conversational difference between in-game conversation and out-of-game conversation. Again, that term's kind of abrupt and almost feels like you're denigrating or insulting the person that wants to have the conversation out of game, or separate from the sequence of gameplay. But the reality is that this concept of the metagame is that there are things that we as players think of that our character could not possibly have thought of, and so we have to discuss these things in the meta, in above the table, so to speak. And in this case, the tabletop conversations that are in game are considered to be canon for the story, so to speak. So if you said something as a blurt, you in theory are given the opportunity to change that to be a metagame conversation, because you're now lifting it away from the tabletop. And again, the term gets a easier pass when we speak of it as metagame than if we are trying to play hardcore to the rules, and whatever you say at the table is canon. This idea of metagame gives us the opportunity to step away and say, wait a minute, I want to talk about something that's not actually in the scene, but I as a player want to discuss, or as a game master want to bring up. The idea of these general terms give you an idea of what the environment in a game session will be. The game master is going to be providing kind of guidance to the story. It doesn't mean that he's necessarily directing what actions the players might take, but he is going to adjudicate the final outcomes of those. As I said, there are game systems that are trying to change that, and I think they're going to find that it's far better to leave that in the hands of the storyteller, only because it maintains a continuity and does not build up any internal pressures between the players and the director, game master. The term game master, of course, has a lot of one-to-one correlation. You can be a dungeon master or a games master or a storyteller or a director. All these terms mean fundamentally the same thing, that you're the person who makes the decisions about the flow of the story and adjudicate any conflicts within it. Okay, so now we need to talk a little bit about those terms that would be immersive. And when I'm talking about immersion terms, these are things that are sort of the basis of jargon within the role-playing community. And these are basically terms that, by having a generally accepted definition, make it easier for you to gain information and distribute information within your game sessions. So we're going to be talking about, I gotta put my little list up here. The first thing we're going to talk about is the concepts of role play. We've already talked a little bit about a session, and I have heard a lot of people misuse this next term, making it directly comparative to the session. And I want to differentiate them to make it a little bit easier for us to carry on conversations in the future about role-playing games, because the concepts are different, not just the terms, but we're not talking about synonyms here. So when we talk about a game session, we're talking about the period of time in which you play. And that game session can be one of a half dozen or so different concepts. So we're going to talk about these in particular. First, we're going to talk about the very idea of your session. Is your session, or do you intend your session to be a standalone story in its own right? Hang on just a second. Yeah, I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. So, when we talk, therefore, about a session, it's about a period of time. This is usually a single term. I've kind of expanded this to 3 different terms to make it clear. A session is a session, single time bracket. A group of time periods that link together that are intentionally associated with one another are called a series. And if your story of the players is their lifetime story, then that would be a saga. And each of these terms are defined in this fashion so that you can differentiate a single shot, one-time thing from the longer terms. But in the vernacular, in the jargon of the gamers, the concept of the long-term game series, counting every session that a group plays together, can be considered a campaign. And there's a nuance in that the campaign really should be, from its origins, linked together stories that describe the passage of time. Historically, the idea is that soldiery, military units, would literally go on a military campaign, being the series of adventures and engagements that they undertake while accomplishing whatever their mission is. And this is, in many cases, separate from the way most people play role-play games, because they simply are doing fundamentally singular one-shots and then linking them together simply by saying, we're playing on Tuesdays, so that is our Tuesday campaign. And I only wanted to give the differentiation because it ties to the origins. Yes, that means I pull out my teeth and talk about back in my day when the games were young and we were all fundamentally war gamers and we understood. Okay, the idea is that if you want to link your games together and call them a campaign, that's fine, but realize that most storytelling does not take a campaign form. As a matter of fact, usually it's just single sessions one after the other, and the persona develop and advance in the vacuum between sessions, and so therefore it's not essentially a full-on campaign. So what's smaller than that, therefore, if the campaign is supposed to be the long expanded story, what is it you would use for those other terms? Well, as I said, I use the term session, but perhaps you call it a module. And generally speaking, if a game master is utilizing pre-printed materials, it's set up in either a chapter format or a modular format, or it can be actually considered a single shot adventure. And beyond that, there is the outcome, which is generally to track these adventures in a sequential way to grant advancement, and that would therefore be milestones. And the accomplishment of the tasks that make it to the next milestone would be the modular nature, could make it either a session or a series, but generally a milestone won't be the end of a saga. It's going to be a marker along the way. Another way to consider this is the idea of a situation. And a situation, you could have several situations within a play session, and those collective situations are considered to have been perhaps an encounter, which would be the actual engagement with a creature, or perhaps it's actually a measure of the entire adventure of the night session. So the terms begin to blur, and that's the reason why I want to call them immersion terms, because you will develop within your play group the vernacular, the conversational jargon that you'll use for your game sessions. And the NycosRPG mechanism, which uses the terms I've referred to, session, series, and saga, simply try to simplify that down to singular terms to make it easier. Now, of course, adventures can carry both a conflict or a non-conflict agenda. Some game masters really enjoy the bringing of monsters and the player's interaction with trying to overcome these variances in the creatures that they face, and therefore it's all about the battles, the actual conflicts. Sometimes conflicts aren't necessarily military, they could be political, they could be dynamic, they could be familial. The idea here is that you have some sessions that are heavy on conflict and others that are not. And those that are considered to be non conflict sometimes are perceived to be of lesser value. So there are players who develop a taste for the mechanical conflict or the actual combat of a system, and therefore just constantly want to be driven by that portion of the game. And I'm not isolating this to be disparaging of it, but it's simply a choice of the way one plays, and that leads also to the next mechanism, which is there is a difference between role playing and role playing. I know that sounds crazy, but think of the term role in the multiple spellings. You know, sonically they're the same, phonetically they're the same, but their spellings are different. Role playing, ROLE playing, means that it's going to be personality driven. It's going to be interactions that are done, you know, as a direct one-to-one allegory with what's going on in the game. So you will, for example, talk to the innkeeper, or you'll make your challenges against the villain or whatever, versus role play, ROLL play, where everything boils down to the die rolls. And NycosRPG is really a mechanism that uses both. We generally try to role play with the ROLE as much as possible and default only to die rolling when the mechanism is inadequate to cover the actual skill of the persona. And then finally, there's going to be a differentiation of those conversations that are in character versus those that are out of character. In other words, when you are in a scene and you are directly face to face with an NPC, the conversation will feel normal when you speak of it in the first. You speak in the first person and they speak in the first person as they are directing their conversation with you. And then out of character is when you have a question about the game mechanism, you simply are turning to another player at the table and saying, which dice do I use? What is my, you know, what are my choices, kind of thing. And that out of character conversation is separate from what is in game conversation. So that's really the reason for those concepts of the differentiation, is to show that there are within the game session a bunch of multi-functions that occur simultaneously, and so it can be a bit confusing until you begin to understand what these differentiations really mean. For example, we already talked about it before, we're going to mention it again, the very idea of the metagame. What is it your character is trying to do in terms of a week-over-week advancement? Where are they trying to get to in terms of physical location in-game, but also where you are, as a player, want to take your character within the game? So these concepts are important to differentiate, to be able to understand the scalar differences within the framework and parameters of the actual gameplay. Once you have a really good understanding of this, you are fundamentally immersed in the game's environment because you get it when the other players are talking about things that seem disjointed or disconnected. All right, so mechanically we're going to talk about design terms, and this is in case of the sliding scale. I've mentioned before about my mechanism, the World in Around 80 Days, where one of the chief mechanisms is the nesting doll theory. And the idea is that the adventure that you are creating for your players includes a bunch of different scales that your adventure discussion needs to move through as you progress. So the first level of this, of course, is the very building of your adventure team, whether you call it a cadre or your games group or your party of adventurers. Those terms are synonymous. The idea of the group individually and collectively working together towards the objective become the basis for most of your conversations. So you speak of things in terms of what the party will do, what the collective will do. I've kind of isolated to the term cadre because it feels a bit more regimented. It isn't intended to be a replacement for games group or whatever. It's just yet another term to use for it. But it does allow you to do things like speak of the collective collectively. You're going to give yourself the ability to have a term that refers to the group, so that way you can give direction, get information from the players and such as a collective about what they're wanting to accomplish, and this helps to move the fluidity of the session, series, or saga along its path. Above that, the next scale above that is the actual community that they are in. And while in certain cases the party is adventuring and moving across space physically, and therefore don't have a specific community they are part of, nonetheless, the idea of community here would include, for example, caravans or shipmates if you're traveling by vessels or whatever. And the idea is that the community is the limited amount of resources that they can get to in that particular scene. That is to say, you're in a specific. My tongue's not working today. You're in a specific location with a specific set of opportunities that the players have to reach outside of the actual adventure team to get resources. Perhaps this is the inn that they're staying in, or perhaps it's the number of buildings that they're currently interacting with. But the idea here is that the community is again, the upscale from the adventure team, the player base. The next above that would be the town, city, megalopolis, whatever the larger community around them would be. And larger in this case is what can they reach to within a couple of days of where they are. It can be the only things they can get to within a day, but that depends on the density of the population and such. But generally speaking, it's referring to how the players can expand their resources in game by looking to the wider area around them. Beyond that, of course, you can have individual feudal states where the city is a kingdom. It is a established locale that is also the local governance. And then beyond that, you have, of course, the concepts of the domains, those areas that work together to communicate, to protect themselves and work together. Then you've got the realm, which might be larger than that. You might have several different domains and feudal states competing with each other. And then finally, you've got the world. And this expanding, each of these circles is expanding the resources, expanding the opportunities, and therefore also increasing the amount of time the players would need to interact with the items that they are dealing with. In the case of the campaigns that I'm currently running, most of them are operating within the town or city area, although we have one that's already moved into perhaps developing a feudal state or exerting themselves to become leaders of a domain. The mechanism changes the way you play. It changes the possibility of action, and it increases the amount of time that the players have to wait for the results of their actions to be experienced. In the world of Nykos in particular, of course, I've got methodologies that allow the players to interact in a relatively shorter period of time than would normally be possible, simply to affect the differentiation between Group A that is operating at the adventure level. They're actually in the throes of a series of actions that keep them busy throughout the entire session. And those that are on the other end of the spectrum that are up at the feudal state or the domain level, where their information is more worldwide affecting, but it also takes longer for those turns to develop. And so finding ways to merge those two concepts chronologically allow you to play to connect players of different levels of intensity within their stories and still make it coherent and feel like they're part of the same worldview. Now we're going to talk about operational terms, and these are the kinds of terms that we have to have to actually play the game. When you're talking about operational terms, you're talking about things like the establishment or the establishing shot. The idea is that when you start the adventure, you're going to be providing the players with the details of what has happened before, perhaps doing a reminder. In our case, we use something called OSSF, Our Story So Far. And this establishment kind of brings all the players, after being apart from each other for, say, a week or so, it takes time to reacclimate and remember what's going on in the scene and in the area and such. And so the establishment is the part of the operation where the players are being reacclimated. Generally speaking, this will be a preamble by the game master who's considering and driving the story forward. He's going to provide the players with an update on what happened last week and how we're starting. I've kind of flipped the script there, and I caused the story to be fundamentally operating in the collective memory of my players, and therefore they're going to be establishing what they know, what they are pursuing, what's going on, what their connections are with the community and such like. Perhaps even reminding me of the encounters that we were in last time that need to be resolved, because sometimes I leave them a cliffhanger. But the idea here is that your establishment, as part of your operational terms, is going to give them the basis for decision making going forward. Beyond that, of course, you have the general details, and often these don't need to be restated every session, but sometimes as a refresher, I'll mention, we are in the kingdom of this. This is the information from the other groups that are important to what this group is doing. They're just general details about the world. And also to add in particular conditions that might be in place in this game session. In this third type, the conditions really are focused on things like that are variable, that are outside of the control of the player. So it's weather, climate, geological changes like earthquakes, floods, fires, that kind of thing. And by having an establishment of the conditions, we let the players know what their what kinds of things might be altering or adjusting their choices in the session. Also, this is from the standpoint of world building, this is a critical part that you might want to consider to include in your game sessions, which is points of interest. These are physical or geographical notes that you want to include to flesh out the environment, to make it feel more like a place for them to operate, but it also gives them maybe some context for the things that are going on in the scene, and to provide the capacity to vary upon the theme and adjust their actions by taking into account these points of interest. And they don't necessarily have to be it doesn't have to be in reference to magics or fantastic things, but it could be. So just realize that the points of interest can have a graduated scale placed upon them. Next will be the clarifications, and generally this is when the players have provided information about what they remember from last week, but there are details that they can't. It's a matter of the director, storyteller, game master to clarify and answer any questions that the players might have to increase their comfortability with the scene that they are in, and also to provide any particular revelations, things that they might have noticed over being in the scene for a longer period of time. For example, if you come to live in a village, it might become a particular revelation that a certain person goes by the village hotel or whatever that the players are staying in on a regular basis, and therefore you might be giving additional story hooks. You might be giving red herrings, providing the players alternate options so that they don't have to follow the things of their memory if they can't clearly draw their mind back to it. And of course, specific details that might have changed week over week. So these are all operational terms that you would talk about. So you'd say, I've got a clarification of what you just said, or, oh, by the way, there's a point of interest which is nearby, or well, you may have had a particular revelation last week, so let's talk about what that would be and make the dice rolls that are appropriate or whatever. Okay, so when we're talking to and with players, it's sometimes important to talk about game-specific terms. Now, this is generally in the meta of play. It's not actually something that comes up in your conversation, but it's sometimes important to talk about these things. And so the first thing we have to talk about is which game system you are using. If someone says we're going to play Dungeons and Dragons, yes, that can be a given that the system is Dungeons and Dragons. But perhaps they're not. Perhaps they are playing Savage Worlds, or perhaps they are playing NycosRPG. They might say, this is our weekly D&D game, but unless it's actually in Dungeons and Dragons, it's more important to know that you're playing in a different game system. So, for example, at the game store Board Games Paradise that I'm affiliated with, who got me this really cool hat, so thank you, Board Game Paradise. The sessions that I run there are twice a week introductory role play sessions, and for a long time I was using the D&D 5e mechanism, and before that the 3.5 and so on. But the idea is that it was always D&D until we converted to NycosRPG, and so we now call it the weekly RPG introductory. We don't say the Dungeons and Dragons introductory. Although mechanically role-play games are role-play games, and there are nuances to the way they play, but generally speaking, RPG fits the category. Nonetheless, knowing the specific game system is important because it does give a certain element of flavor to the way the game plays. Then we have to talk about the edition or version. Dungeons and Dragons has gone through a bunch of changes over the decades. You have Dungeons and Dragons, then you have Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then you have the Expert series of modules that were back to Dungeons and Dragons, and then there was second edition, and then there was third, 3.5, fourth, fifth, and all of these editions or versions have nuanced play differences between them. And if you invite someone to come and play and you say, oh, by the way, we're playing 4th edition, you may find them not as satisfied with that. So realize that the mechanism that you play with is a game-specific term. So you would say, we're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5e, or Dungeons & Dragons 5e 2024. There are a lot of different ways to talk about it. The mechanistic changes of the last iteration last edition moving from the 2014 to the 2024 intentionally didn't want to knock down the barrier, because that 5e mechanism was so much more effective than the 3.5 that came before it, that it didn't want to lose their momentum. Ironically, I think that they've kind of shot themselves in the foot, but that's a completely different subject, so we're going to stay off of that. So let's go back to what about in terms of game-specific terms. Yes, so now we've got your game system, and you've got your edition, your version that's being played. The next would be story path or game environment. Certain publishers, such as Pathfinder, companies such as Paizo Publishing, have really focused on building the story path within their properties. This is in part to make it easier for them to concentrate the story so that the players feel that immersion that we're always looking for in a single volume. So they'll do a story path book, which is a series of adventures intended to bring players from one level of advancement to a higher level of advancement over time. Or perhaps you're playing in a games environment. There are several different game worlds like Harn under Columbia Games, where it's not game system specific, but it gives general understandings of things like locale, climate, environment, and such in a way that the game feels more coherent. And so most game masters sort of pick and choose their path through these. In the case of NycosRPG, I developed in the first 6 years of playing what is known as the Grand Arc, and therefore our story is a wheel, if you will, that's laid across the game environment, but the game environment doesn't change under it, and therefore the story continuity is carried over session over session, year over year, and therefore you can actually play through the same conceptual period of time in the arc and have rapidly and radically different outcomes. But the idea is that you're still playing within that story path so that everything can still remain familiar to you as a player. Of course, then we have to talk about the materials that a game system will have. For example, in Dungeons and Dragons, the stipulations are that generally speaking, you have to have Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and DM's Guide as minimal ownership. But as they add additional properties, they add requirements for you to include those as well. So Tasha's, Volos, and such like these other supplement books become part of the almost required reading to continue to play in that story, because your players are, are going to be utilizing the resources found in those books. So they eventually become canon for the games group whenever those rules are added. And these tools can also be whether you are playing a theater of the mind game such as NycosRPG that doesn't require any miniatures. All you're bringing with you is your imagination, or perhaps you are mapping, so you've got to have your grid and hex paper for tracking where you are in the world as it is. And these tools, even to the point of miniatures, can fundamentally be required if the game system is that detailed. For example, in 4th edition and even 5e, there are a lot of players who demand or require there to be a game map so that they can make their decisions because they're taking into account relative positioning and a lot of microcosmic details that are better handled with a miniature representation than a narrative description because of their play styles. Next are the issues of conflict resolution methodologies, and I'm not talking about player versus player. We'll talk about that a little bit later in a particular slide, but we're talking about in this case the idea of how do you resolve issues in game. Dungeons and Dragons uses, for the most part, a saving throw mechanism in the case of uncontrollables, and then a skills check in the case of resolvables. And then finally, they have their combat system, which is, again, each system has its own uniqueness and proclivities, positives and negatives. But knowing your conflict resolution methodology, knowing which mechanism you're using, helps to make your play sessions more coherent because the players can develop familiarity and understanding of these as you go along. Next will be the scoring and awards processes, and generally speaking, most RPGs out there require the game master to award earning points or victory points or item resolutions or whatever to provide scoring and awards for the players. In other words, they've gone on an adventure, they've defeated the monster, they grab the monster's loot. That's the simplest way of handling the rewards system, is to have a tangible outcome from the scene. That's not necessarily useful or possible in certain game scenario situations. So, for example, if you've got a very drama-heavy campaign, but the mechanism of scoring is based on the things that you kill, disable, or destroy, that's going to be a long slog session over session. And my players, especially my older veteran players, would be able to tell you how much of a pain that can be. I had characters that stayed the same level for 6, 8, 10 weeks, session over session, and were beginning to wonder whether or not there was any advancement within the game because
they hadn't killed any monsters, and the way the game was originally written, that's really the only place that gave award points. So the idea is you need to know what mechanism is for your advancement, whether it be experience points based or whether it be milestone or number of sessions, that kind of thing. Finally, you have to have some idea of the win conditions and benchmarks. It doesn't mean that you are going to be playing a game that has a winner. I did a video on winning at roleplay games, so I'm going to winning right here. There should be a marker for the episode on how you can win at Dungeons and Dragons. But the idea here is that in any game system, you do have points of advancement and even a conclusion built into the system. For example, Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition fundamentally has a adventuring level maximum of around 20 levels. That's not always the case, but generally speaking, a character is ready to retire when it's reached its 20th level in game. Mechanically, that might be a year, might be 2 years. The challenge with any system that has a win condition or a limitation like that is that sometimes it feels arbitrary and the players don't get satisfaction because the end doesn't give them fulfillment. But that's a completely different issue. From the standpoint of knowing your game system, knowing the specific win conditions helps you to understand when your character has reached its objective or reached its fulfillment point. Next, we're going to talk about the pure logistics of role-playing games. There are not a lot of things that are required to play a role-play game. As a matter of fact, if you are playing a one-shot, you really don't even need a persona sheet. The character sheet is a luxury, and that while players love to build characters and tend to want to keep them session over session, if you're playing one-shots, they're really not a restriction to play. But nonetheless, holding on to the idea of a character sheet is ubiquitous to role-playing games, regardless of what mechanism you're playing. Beyond that, there are a lot of minor items that can be helped by keeping notes and records. The next one we're going to talk about is a session record, and generally this is most useful for your campaign settings when you are running a saga where the episodes are connected to one another. Having a means of maintaining session records really help you to remember not only when something happened, where it happened, but what happened. And that's really useful, not only in the promotion and growth of member berries. We'll do an entire episode on that. But also keeping track of who took what action when is important in the long term to know how the story is progressing. Elements of the session records can be the modes of timekeeping. There are not a lot of emphasis. There is not a lot of emphasis on clocks in a role-playing system because you are simply playing through. It's a day, it's a night, it's a day, it's a night, and it's not particularly important in terms of hours, minutes, seconds. But keeping time might be useful for things like a campaign series where you've got certain actions that have to occur at a certain time, and therefore timekeeping becomes important. We are actually in a countdown in the world of Nykos right now for a transitional change, and that's in the story itself, and so therefore timekeeping becomes essential. But other items beyond timekeeping would be inventory tracking, and this perhaps is one of the best ways to do timekeeping is track the inventory of items that they need for the adventuring that they're doing. So, for example, if they're entering caverns or caves, they have to have some sort of light source. Most light sources have a limited run, especially when you're talking about in a fantasy setting, perhaps more so than the others. But the idea of how long a torch will burn and how long a lantern can stay lit are concerns that can really help the game's timekeeping, because they can track of how long they've been underground by the number of those sources they've run through. Um, Other things are asset management. If they have animals and steeds, then they have to worry about food and supplies for handling that. Perhaps they have magic items that need to be recharged. Perhaps there's a bunch of variables in dealing with asset management that really do. They help with the timing, but more importantly, they are subject to the timing. And that leads to, of course, then the issue of what things happen when during a combat scene, and therefore conflict timing is also essentially needing to be tracked. So fundamentally, this is where the hit points basis of Dungeons and Dragons had its origin, because the idea is that a fight can continue as long as the player has hit points, and so therefore, by tracking effectively when they lose hit points and such, you're providing your players with an idea of how long they can continue the fight they're in without running into inconvenient things like injury, unconsciousness, and death. So, and then finally, you have to have post-conflict resolution, and that's going through the looting process, if you will, if you're of that kind of murder hope mindset, or perhaps calling the authorities, getting eyewitness reports and such. But then post-conflict resolution is also something that needs to be handled from a logistics standpoint in game. And by understanding the way your game master or storyteller does the logistics really helps to develop your understanding of the game, and understanding these terms and how they apply to one another really helps to accomplish that goal. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about protocol and etiquette, and this has to do with actual continuity of the game session, more so than it does with adhering to a particular rule system. When I speak of protocols here, it's simply understood mechanisms, and these don't necessarily have terms, so I'm going to be kind of going over them relatively quickly. Some of the protocols of role-play games would be included setting and time. If you're going to be playing on Tuesdays at 6 p.m., then be at the store, be at the location, maybe 10 minutes before to get prepared. But realize that the other players have considerations of time as well as you. So by being polite and prompt at being at the session, you make for a more smooth game transition. This leads therefore to the secondary part of this, and that is how much time is really allotted for. Actually, I'm gonna change course. We're gonna drop out of protocols and etiquette. We're gonna talk instead about continuity and coherency. I perhaps mislabeled this. The idea is that continuity and coherency is important for the players to be able to carry the episode from session to session, and the way in which you are telling the story and the mechanisms that you're utilizing help to define these for the players. So the first thing you have to talk about is your location. If the players have a location in the game, they've achieved reaching, say, Gatterbury or whatever. Now that they're at Gatterbury, they can start to get a development of an understanding of the location. What's here? Who's here? Why are they here? What are the variables to the population? What are the local rites and rituals? That kind of thing. And this portion of the understanding that you develop with your game master really is about you as a player learning to acclimate to the environment that you're in. If it's a dangerous and scary place, then you don't spend a lot of time on the streets. If the locals are very suspicious, then you make sure to do a lot of actions in the open so they can be aware of what you're doing. In addition to the information though about your location and situation, you as a game master also have to bring to the table for the players the idea of thematic or conditional variables. And these are fun things like Is it snowing? Is it raining? Has there been bad weather? Is there a particularly annoying villain operating in the area? Are we moving into a different genre setting? For example, you've been out in a much more open, fast play fantasy setting, and suddenly you're on the edge of Ravensloft, and so the adventure has taken a much darker turn. You need to convey the information about thematic and conditional changes so your players can adapt their play, which means the vocabulary can and must change as well for them to feel this change in theme. If you simply state that we're on the edge of Ravensloft, but you don't present any of the darker elements, you do your players a disservice because they won't see them as any different than a physical name of a location. There's also a matter of chronological linearity. If you have something that happened at a certain point in time, they need to be aware of the differentiation in time from that event. And sometimes this is stark and there's a radical change, but normally it's just a general gradual clicking away of the tickings of the clock, so to speak. Now, there are also going to be in any setting certain absolutes and variables. So, for example, if known that the local authorities are very harsh on conflict in public, the players need to be made aware of it in the most clear terms. And if that means causing an adherence to those rules to represent the absolutes of the community, so be it. But the main thing about that is you want to maintain the continuity that you set in that scene week over week, session after session, or else the players will feel that the world's reality is slipping. And this really comes down to the way you handle story conservation and retconning. A retcon is fundamentally a time when you back up a scene and change the outcome because you made a mistake or the conditions were not right. You made some kind of an error, or the players made an error, or whatever. And so a retcon, it can stick, but the players have to be quite aware of what the ramifications of that change might be. And then finally, there's going to be a big issue when you talk about players in a game session, and this might be where we lead back to protocols and etiquette, is that it's quite easy for a player to hear something in a game session that they would not have as a character been privy to. And so therefore it's important to hold the line between player knowledge and collective awareness. It's fine to allow players to hear what goes on in other people's scenes, but they have to be able to differentiate what information was gleaned from that scene because they may or may not have access to it. And then finally, there's the metagame effect. And I know I've already hit metagame a couple of times, but the real issue in terms of protocol and etiquette is that if a player is trying to utilize the activities in a game to cause a change in the way they're guiding their character, that's acceptable because they are utilizing the metagame effect to cause that change to occur. But many players instead choose to try to reach a metagame conclusion without having any substantial evidence leading in that direction. In other words, as in Dungeons and Dragons rule system, currently you can, at any certain level advancement, you can pick up a new feat. And as you gain that feat, it may have nothing to do with anything you've done before because that game mechanic allows that to occur. And from a role-play situation and the very concept of playing a role-play game, a person who does this metagame effect is really making the transition easier because they're playing into the advance that they want. And this is a very favorable effect. And the only place where I would consider the metagame to be important is that they're actually considering in advance how to accomplish the things they want to in game. Alrighty. Okay, so this conversation has been really an attempt to demystify the tabletop. If you haven't played a role-playing game before or even experienced one, I'd recommend you check it out at your nearby friendly local area game store, what I call a flagship, and get a chance to experience the thought process that goes into a role-playing game, because I think you'll find that it really amplifies your own creativity and reinvigorates your imagination and provides you a means to recapture the value of active imagination. So, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, make sure you include them below in the comment section. I tend to respond to those within a couple of days. So I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have a conversation about what happens at your games table. What particular terms have you run into in game that you don't find anywhere else that might need to be clarified for other people? Feel free to include all of that in the comment section. Make sure you like and subscribe, because this show is endeavoring to provide you and everyone else with the idea of how they can improve their game sessions and have more fun and develop their creative and active imagination along the way. All right, and finally, in parting shots, realize that the jargon and vernacular of role-playing games is actually intended to be a shared language. It's not meant to be a isolating or limiting factor. You don't have to know any of these terms to play, but by learning and understanding the different terms and the different mechanics that go into role-play games, you give yourself an opportunity to join the richer, wider culture and family that is RPGers. I want to thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next episode. Tonight is particularly going to be interesting, so make sure you watch the Nycos Nightly News to catch up on everything that's going on in all of our active campaigns. I will see you all next session.